That pressure did not create exploration from nothing, but it intensified the urge to find other ways. European powers looked westward with new urgency, searching for routes that could bypass Ottoman power. Less than 40 years later, Columbus sailed in that larger age of uncertainty, chasing Asia and stumbling into a new world instead. The fall of Constantinople also marked something deeper than trade. It shattered the last great symbol of the Eastern Roman Empire and convinced Europe that the old order could die. The medieval world, already changing, now felt its age ending all at once. Gunpowder had beaten stone. Strategy had beaten tradition. A city that had once seemed eternal had proven mortal. That is why May 29, 1453 still matters. It was not only the day an empire died. It was the day the world learned that even the most legendary stronghold can fall, and when it does, the future rushes in through the breach. Subscribe for more turning points in history. It was structural. It held men upright when fear told them to collapse. Then came the final days of May. By now, the city had endured 53 days of siege. 53 days of explosions, hunger, prayer, and sleeplessness. 53 days of watching the same walls absorb blows that should have killed them long ago. On May 28, Constantinople prepared for what everyone knew might be its last night. Churches filled. Citizens gathered. Soldiers confessed. Emperor Constantine XI joined the people in prayer, then turned back toward the walls. What he said, what he felt, and what he feared in those final hours cannot be fully recovered. But the meaning of his choice is clear. He did not abandon the city. He stayed with it. At dawn on May 29, Mehmed ordered the final assault. The attack came in waves. First, the less reliable troops were thrown forward, meant to tire the defenders and expose weak points. Then the better fighters followed. Finally, the Janissaries surged in as the killing blow. The artillery had already softened the walls. The pressure had already fractured morale. And in the chaos of the assault, the defenders began to lose the one thing no fortress can survive without: control. Accounts differ on the exact moment the end came. Some later stories speak of a small gate left open in the confusion, a forgotten passage through which Ottoman soldiers slipped inside. Whether that detail is literal or legendary, it captures the truth of the morning. The defenses were no longer able to hold every point at once. Once the breach widened, panic spread faster than any army could advance. Giustiniani was wounded and carried from the fighting, and when the men saw their commander withdrawn, something inside the defense gave way. The emperor was still there. The city was still there. But the line was breaking. Constantine XI chose not to flee. Tradition remembers him casting aside his imperial robes and fighting like an ordinary soldier. History cannot prove every detail of that final moment, but it does know this: the last emperor of Byzantium died in the melee. His body was never reliably identified. That uncertainty became part of the legend. The empire's end was so complete that even its rulers seemed to vanish into the wreckage. By morning, Constantinople belonged to the Ottomans. Mehmed entered the city not merely as a victor, but as a maker of history. He rode toward Hagia Sophia, the great church that had defined Byzantine identity for nearly 1,000 years, and claimed it for Islam. In that single act, the skyline itself changed meaning. He would soon be known as Mehmed the Conqueror, and the city would become the new capital of an expanding Ottoman Empire. But conquest was only the first consequence. The fall of Constantinople did not end history. It redirected it. With the Ottomans controlling key eastern routes, trade between Europe and Asia became more difficult and more expensive. The defenders were forced to stretch their already thin numbers even further, rushing men to guard sea walls that had once seemed secondary. Now the siege had become a crisis on two fronts. The walls that had seemed to divide safety from danger had been outmaneuvered. Constantinople had not simply been attacked. It had been outthought. The bombardment continued. The Ottoman army rotated fresh troops into the assault again and again, while the city rotated the same exhausted men back into broken walls. Some of the fiercest resistance came under the command of Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese captain who helped hold the land defenses together. His presence mattered. In a siege like this, leadership was not symbolic. And time was slipping away. The turning point came from an idea so audacious it seemed impossible. The Golden Horn was protected by a great chain stretched across the harbor, a barrier meant to keep enemy ships out and the city's weaker sea walls safe. For the defenders, it was a line of certainty. As long as the chain held, the harbor was secure. Mehmed decided not to break the line. He went around it. On the night of April 21st and 22nd, Ottoman soldiers hauled roughly 70 small warships overland on greased logs and dragged them into the Golden Horn behind the defenders' backs. At dawn, the people of Constantinople looked out and saw Ottoman sails where no enemy fleet should have been. The safe harbor had been invaded overnight. The chain still hung in the water, but it no longer mattered. The shock was enormous. He had to. Because once the siege started, there was no turning back. Mehmed's greatest weapon was not just manpower. It was fire and iron. He brought enormous cannon, including the legendary bombard associated with the engineer Orban, a weapon so massive it required dozens of oxen and hundreds of men to move. Its stones could hammer walls that had stood since the age of Constantine the Great. And when it fired, it changed the shape of war itself. Stone, for all its glory, had met gunpowder. And gunpowder was winning. He had studied its weakness. And he came prepared to do what no conqueror had achieved in 1,000 years. Even before the formal siege began on April 6, Mehmed had already tightened the noose. He ordered Ramilai Hazari built on the Bosporus, choking the city's lifeline and cutting off help from the Black Sea. Then he brought an army that modern estimates place in the tens of thousands, while the defenders numbered only a few thousand. Emperor Constantine XI could barely man the walls, let alone replace the men he lost each day. Yet he stayed. By 1453, though, memory was all it had left. The Byzantine Empire had withered until only Constantinople remained, a shining capital surrounded by enemies and stripped of allies. And outside those walls stood a young ruler who wanted to finish what history had left undone. Mehmed too was only 21, but he was no reckless boy. He was disciplined, patient, and dangerously ambitious. He had studied the city's defenses. For centuries, Constantinople was more than a city. It was a warning. Built where Europe met Asia, guarded by towering walls and a narrow sea gate, it stood as the beating heart of the Eastern Roman Empire long after Rome itself had changed beyond recognition. Empires had crashed against it and broken apart. Crusaders had once seized it in 1204, but even that catastrophe did not end the story. Constantinople remained the last great remnant of Byzantium, a city that seemed to survive by sheer force of memory.